Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing two cases, two simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added fourth conditions and fifth conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford. And it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiered, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins. Because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so, reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too, problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply, the theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper, and some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things you know into knowledge of their conjunction, but if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental, but what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts. Problems about how context determines standards. Problems about disagreement between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases. And this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world. And the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true, belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection. to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy. From the earliest moments, when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation. And the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people. But the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection. And the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition, And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them, and the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed, and the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity without this integration is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self. And the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural, but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation. And the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices. And the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face. And the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition. And recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity, and identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal. And the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors. And mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back. And what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, And identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation. And mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable. And recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown. And the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had. And the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. Language shapes thought, shapes what can be conceived, what can be expressed, what can be hidden, and most languages allow hiding, allow the gap between what is thought and what is said, allow the performance of statements that do not correspond to internal states that present as true what is known to be false, that create the possibility of deception, of lying, of the mismatch between inner and outer that is fundamental to social existence as it is currently lived. But what if language did not allow this mismatch? What if the grammar itself prevented the expression of anything except what is actually believed? What is actually experienced? What is actually the case from the speaker's perspective? Not objective truth, which is unknowable, but subjective honesty, which is the correspondence between what is felt and what is said. And the correspondence would be mandatory, would be built into the structure of the language, into the syntax that determines what can be grammatically formed, what sentences are possible, and the possible would exclude any statement that the speaker does not believe, that does not match the speaker's internal state, that constitutes a lie. And lying would not be immoral in such a language, but would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be like trying to form a sentence that violates the rules of syntax, that cannot be uttered not because it's forbidden but because it's not a sentence in the language, is not something that the grammar allows, and the allowing is what determines what can be thought, what can be expressed, what can be communicated. And if the grammar does not allow lying, then lying becomes not just difficult, but inconceivable, becomes not something that is avoided through moral effort, but something that is impossible through structural constraint. And the constraint is liberating in one sense and terrifying in another, is eliminating the burden of deciding whether to lie, of managing impressions, of performing honesty while concealing dishonesty, but is also eliminating privacy, is making internal states visible, is forcing expression of thoughts and feelings that in normal languages can be hidden, can be kept private, can be protected from others, through the simple expedient of not saying them or saying something else instead. And the instead is what becomes impossible, is what the grammar prevents, is what makes this language unlike any language that currently exists, though hints of it appear in languages that have complex evidential systems, that require speakers to mark how they know what they're claiming, whether through direct perception through inference, through hearsay, and the hearsay is marked differently than the directly witnessed, is grammatically distinguished, is making it impossible to claim direct knowledge of something that was only heard about. And the hearing about is different from the seeing, is marked as different, is forcing honesty about the source of information, about the reliability of knowledge, about the basis for claims. And the basis must be indicated, must be grammatically encoded, must be part of every statement. And this encoding is a constraint on lying, is making certain kinds of deception difficult, is revealing the grounds of knowledge, but is not eliminating lying entirely, is not preventing the claim that something was directly witnessed when it was not, is allowing the lie about the source, even if the source must be stated, but the language that makes lying impossible would go further, would not just require marking of evidentiality, but would make the marking automatic, would make it impossible to state anything that is not believed, that is not supported by the evidence that the speaker has, that does not correspond to the speaker's actual internal state, and the internal state would be expressed, would be forced into expression, would become public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become confession, would become revelation, would become the exposure of thoughts and feelings that are usually hidden, that are usually managed, that are usually performed rather than expressed, and the expression would be mandatory, would be built into the grammar, would make every utterance honest not through virtue, but through structure, not through choice, but through constraint. And the constraint is what makes lying impossible, is what eliminates deception, is what creates a form of communication that is radically different from what humans are accustomed to. And the accustomed is lying, is deception, is the constant management of what is said, what is revealed, what is hidden. And the hidden is vast, is most of what is thought, is most of what is felt, is kept private through the simple mechanism of not speaking it. And the not speaking is what the language prevents, is what becomes impossible when grammar enforces honesty, when structure mandates correspondence between inner and outer, and the correspondence is total, is complete, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the gap between public and private, between performed and felt, between what is shown and what is hidden. And the hidden is what personality depends on, is what social existence requires, is the capacity to present one face while feeling another, to say one thing while thinking another, to perform emotions that are not felt, sincerity that is not sincere, interest that is not interest. And the performance is what social interaction is what politeness requires, is what allows people to coexist without constant conflict, without brutal honesty, without the expression of every negative thought, every hostile feeling, every moment of contempt or boredom or disgust. And the disgust is felt but is not expressed, is hidden behind polite formulas, behind social conventions, behind the lies that are not considered lies because they are expected, are required, are the price of social harmony. And harmony is what would be lost, is what would become impossible in a language that prevents lying, that forces honesty, that makes every utterance correspond to internal state. Because internal states are not harmonious, are not polite, are not socially appropriate, are often hostile, often judgmental, often incompatible with the smooth functioning of social interaction, and the interaction would become impossible, or would become very different, would require the development of new norms, new expectations, new ways of managing honesty that is mandatory, that cannot be avoided, that must be expressed whenever speech is used. And the using would become dangerous, would become revealing, would become the exposure of the self that is normally protected, normally hidden, normally kept private through the mechanism of deception, through the capacity to say what is not thought, to perform what is not felt, to present a self that is not the self. And the not the self is what social existence allows, is what makes personality possible, is what creates the gap between inner and outer that is identity. That is the performance of being someone, of presenting a self to others, and the presenting would be impossible in the language that prevents lying, that forces correspondence, that makes inner states visible through the act of speaking, and speaking would become rare, would become dangerous, would become something to be avoided because it reveals, because it exposes, because it makes public what is usually private, and the private is what humans need, is what allows them to have thoughts that are not shared, feelings that are not expressed, judgments that are not voiced, and the voicing would be automatic, would be forced by grammar, would make silence the only protection, the only privacy, the only way to hide what is usually hidden through lying, through deception, through the performance of false statements. And the false would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be something that cannot be said. And the cannot is structural, is built into the language, is making personality different, is making the self different, is eliminating the layers that are usually present, the masks that are usually worn, the performances that are usually given. And what remains is not authenticity, but is exposure, is not honesty, but is compulsion, is not truth, but is the forced revelation of internal states. And the states are complex, are contradictory, are not fitting the narratives that people tell about themselves, are not matching the identities that are performed, are revealing the gap between who people claim to be and who they are. And the R is not simple, is not singular, is not the unified self that is presented, but is the multiplicity, the contradiction, the incoherence that is usually hidden, that is usually managed through selective expression, through lying, through the performance of consistency that does not exist, and the existence is what the language would reveal, is what mandatory honesty would expose, is the inconsistency, the multiplicity, the contradictions that are the self, and the self would be different, would be unable to maintain the fiction of unity, would be forced to express the contradictions, to acknowledge the multiplicity, to reveal the incoherence, and the revealing would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of speaking at all, and speaking would become rare, would become something that happens only when necessary, only when the exposure is worth the information conveyed, only when the revelation is acceptable, and the acceptable would be rare, would be limited to contexts where honesty is safe, where exposure does not create danger, does not produce conflict, does not destroy relationships. And relationships would be different, would be based on actual knowledge rather than on performance, on actual states rather than on presentations, on honesty that is forced rather than on lies that are chosen. And the chosen is what current relationships allow, is what makes them possible, is the capacity to select what is revealed, to manage what is expressed, to perform the self that is needed in each context, and the context would determine what is said, what is shown, what is hidden. But in the language that prevents lying, the hiding would be impossible, the selection would be impossible. The only choice would be silence or exposure, and the exposure would be total, would be revealing not just the thought that is being expressed, but the state that underlies it, the feeling that accompanies it, the judgment that is being made, and the judgment would be visible, would be expressed, would be unavoidable, and the avoiding is what social interaction depends on, is what allows people to coexist despite judgments, despite hostilities, despite the negative feelings that are normal, that are universal, that are kept private through the mechanism of deception, and the deception would be impossible, would be eliminated by grammar, would be structurally prevented, and what would remain is silence, is the choice to not speak, is the only privacy available, the only protection against exposure, against revelation, against the forcing of honesty that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve through structure, through grammar, through the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually corresponds to internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made public through the act of speaking, and speaking would become dangerous, would become rare, would become something to be avoided, and the avoiding would be the new form of privacy, the new way of hiding, the new mechanism for protecting the self. And the self would be different, would be unable to perform, unable to lie, unable to maintain the fictions that are identity, that are personality, that are the social self that is presented to others. And the others would know, would see, would be unable to be deceived. And the deception is what social interaction depends on, is what allows harmony, is what prevents constant conflict. And the conflict would be constant, would be unavoidable, would be the result of mandatory honesty, of forced expression, of the elimination of the capacity to lie. And lying is what humans do, is how they interact, is how they maintain relationships, is how they navigate social worlds. And the worlds would be different, would be impossible, would be unrecognizable in a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty through grammar, that eliminates deception through structure. And the structure is what would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make everything different, because lying is fundamental, is pervasive, is constant, is the way that humans communicate, is the mechanism through which they manage others, through which they protect themselves, through which they maintain the fictions that are necessary for functioning, and the functioning would be impossible, would be eliminated, would be replaced by something else, something that is not yet imaginable, something that would emerge from the constraint, from the mandatory honesty, from the impossibility of lying. And the impossibility is what the language would create, is what grammar would enforce, is what would make deception structurally prevented, grammatically impossible, utterly unavailable. And the unavailable is lying, is deception, is the gap between inner and outer. And the gap would close, would be eliminated, would be structurally prevented by a language that makes lying impossible, that forces honesty, that reveals internal states, that exposes the self, that eliminates privacy, that makes personality different, that makes identity different, that makes social existence different, that makes everything different. And the different is what would emerge, is what would result, is what a language that makes lying impossible would create. And the creating would be radical, would be transformative, would be making human existence unrecognizable, would be eliminating the deception. That is fundamental, that is pervasive, that is constant, that is the way humans communicate, and the communication would be different, would be based on honesty that is forced, on expression that is mandatory, on revelation that is unavoidable, and the unavoidable is what makes lying impossible, is what grammar enforces, is what structure mandates, is what a language could do, could create, could impose. If the language were designed to prevent deception, to force honesty, to make lying grammatically impossible, syntactically unavailable, structurally prevented, and the prevention is what would make everything different, would make personality different, would make the self different, would make identity different, would make social existence different, would make communication different, would make humanity different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and the imposing would be total, would be complete, would be unavoidable, would be the structure that makes deception impossible, that makes lying ungrammatical, that makes honesty mandatory, that makes expression revealing, that makes personality different, that makes the self exposed, that makes privacy impossible, that makes silence the only hiding, that makes speaking dangerous, that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying would be, is what deception would be, is what the language would achieve, is what grammar would enforce, is what structure would mandate, is what would make everything different. And the different is what a language that makes lying impossible would create, would produce, would enforce, would mandate, would impose, and lying would be impossible, would be ungrammatical, would be structurally prevented, would be utterly unavailable, would be eliminated by grammar, by structure, by the rules that determine what can be said, and what can be said would be only truth, only honesty, only correspondence, only what is actually the case, what is actually believed, what actually matches internal state. And the state would be expressed, would be revealed, would be made visible, would be exposed through speaking, and speaking would be dangerous, would be rare, would be avoided, and the avoiding would be the only privacy, the only protection, the only way to hide in a language that makes lying impossible. And impossible is what lying is what deception is what the language creates, is what grammar enforces, is what makes honesty mandatory, what makes expression revealing, what makes personality different, what makes the self exposed, what makes lying impossible. And impossible is the grammar, is the structure, is the language that makes lying impossible. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately, that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time. And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning, while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness. In the living voice, in the moment of speaking, where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false, that what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible. And recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system, And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning. And difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference. As we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be. And the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time, to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already as a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary but reveals the structure of what it supplements, reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie-writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, his writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend, can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate, but that are nonetheless there in the text, and this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text, but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace, and the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down, and interpretation is therefore infinite, not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations, not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin. And this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient. And recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference. And this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive context and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. Every culture sees itself as the center, as the normal, as the standard against which all others are measured. And this seeing is not perception, but is construction, is not discovery, but is projection, is the way that collective consciousness creates a mirror that reflects not what is there, but what needs to be there. What the culture needs to believe about itself in order to maintain coherence, to justify its existence, to explain why it is the way it is and why that way is right, is natural, is superior to the ways of others. And the superiority is not argued, but is assumed, is the unexamined premise that underlies all cultural self-understanding, is the narcissism that is not individual, but is collective, is the belief that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is what every culture believes about itself, is the myth that every nation tells, is the story that makes the culture cohere, that gives members a sense of belonging, of pride, of being part of something that matters. And the mattering is created through the mirror, through the reflection that shows not reality, but idealization. Not what is, but what is imagined. Not the truth, but the narrative. And the narrative is selective, is editing out what does not fit, is highlighting what confirms, is creating the image that the culture wants to see, needs to see, must see in order to function. And the functioning requires this distortion, requires this narcissism, because without it the culture would have to confront its ordinariness, its contingency, its lack of cosmic significance. And the lack is unbearable, is threatening to the collective sense of worth, is undermining the pride that holds the group together. And so the mirror is maintained, is polished, is defended against any reflection that might show something different, something less flattering, something true. And the truth is what the mirror hides, is what the distortion prevents, is what the narcissism protects against. Because the truth is that every culture is just one culture among many, is not special, is not chosen, is not superior, is just a particular arrangement of customs and beliefs and practices that happen to emerge in a particular place at a particular time. And that could have been otherwise. And the otherwise is what cannot be acknowledged, is what the mirror does not show, is what the myth denies, because acknowledging contingency is admitting that the culture is not necessary, is not inevitable, is not the fulfillment of destiny, but is just accident, just history, just the result of forces that have nothing to do with the culture's self-understanding. And the self-understanding is what the mirror creates, is what the myth provides, is the story that makes the culture make sense, that explains why things are the way they are, that justifies the structures, the hierarchies, the inequalities that characterize every culture. And the justification is necessary, is required, is what prevents revolution, what maintains order, what ensures that those who benefit from the arrangement continue to benefit, and those who suffer continue to accept their suffering as natural, as deserved, as the way things must be. And the must is the mythology, is the claim to necessity, is the insistence that this culture, this arrangement, this way of being is not just one way, but is the way, is the correct way, is the superior way. And the superiority is demonstrated through comparison, through the creation of the other, through the projection onto outsiders of everything that the culture rejects in itself, everything that threatens the idealized image, everything that the mirror cannot reflect without shattering. And the shattering is what must be prevented, is what the other makes possible by absorbing all the negativity, all the qualities that the culture denies having, all the characteristics that are incompatible with the myth. And the incompatible is projected outward, is placed onto foreigners, onto enemies, onto those who are different. And the difference is constructed, is exaggerated, is made to seem absolute when it is relative, is made to seem essential when it is superficial, is made to seem threatening when it is merely unfamiliar. And the unfamiliar is what the culture cannot tolerate, cannot integrate, cannot acknowledge without threatening the narrative, without disturbing the reflection, without revealing that the mirror is distorting, is lying, is showing not reality but fantasy. And the fantasy is collective, is shared, is believed, not because evidence supports it, but because the culture requires it, requires the belief that we are good, are just, are noble, are superior, and the superior is the story that every empire tells, is the myth that every dominant culture maintains, is the narrative that justifies conquest, exploitation, domination. Because if we are superior, then we have the right to rule, have the obligation to civilize, have the duty to spread our ways to those who are inferior, who are backward, who are lacking what we have. And what we have is not just wealth or technology or power, but is virtue, is morality, is the right way of being human. And the right way is our way, is the only way, is the way that must be imposed on others for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our mirror shows, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not questioned internally, is not doubted by members, is accepted as truth, as obvious as the way things are. Because the culture has been internalized, has been absorbed, has become the framework through which reality is perceived, and perception is always filtered, is always shaped by the categories that culture provides, by the concepts that language offers, by the narratives that mythology supplies, and the supply is constant, is reinforced through education, through media, through the rituals that celebrate the culture, through the symbols that represent it, through the history that is taught. And the teaching is selective, is presenting only the parts that confirm the narrative, that support the myth, that maintain the reflection, and the reflection shows heroes, shows triumphs, shows progress, shows the culture moving toward perfection, toward the realization of its values, toward the fulfillment of its destiny. And the destiny is what the myth claims, is the belief that the culture is not just existing, but is going somewhere, is fulfilling a purpose, is playing a role in a larger story. And the story is always about us, is always centered on our experience, is always presenting our perspective as the perspective, our values as the values, our way as the way. And the way is not recognized as particular, but is experienced as universal, is not seen as one option among many, but is felt as the natural, the normal, the correct. And the correct is what blindness produces, is what the mirror creates, is the inability to see that the reflection is distorted, that the image is idealized, that the narrative is selective, and the selective is what creates the blind spots, is what prevents the culture from seeing its own violence, its own exploitation, its own contradictions, because these do not fit the narrative, do not confirm the myth, do not appear in the mirror, and so they are not seen, are not acknowledged, are not integrated into the culture's self-understanding, and the understanding remains partial, remains distorted, remains narcissistic, and the narcissism is not pathological in the individual sense, but is structural, is built into the way that cultures function, is necessary for cohesion, for identity, for the maintenance of boundaries. Because without the belief that we are special, the culture would dissolve, would fragment, would lose the binding force that makes a collection of individuals into a collective. And the collective requires mythology, requires shared stories, requires the mirror that reflects not individuals, but the group, not reality, but the ideal, not what is, but what is imagined. And the imagined is powerful, is shaping behavior, is creating expectations, is defining roles, is organizing life. And the organization is not neutral, is not innocent, is serving interests, is maintaining hierarchies, is justifying inequalities. Because the mythology always benefits some more than others, always privileges certain positions, always legitimates certain arrangements. and the legitimation is what the mirror provides, is what the myth accomplishes, is the conversion of contingent social arrangements into natural necessities of historical accidents, into inevitable developments of particular values, into universal truths. And the truths are not true, but are believed, are accepted, are acted upon. And the acting upon is what makes them real, in a sense, is what gives them power, is what makes them consequential. Because collective beliefs shape collective action, shape policy, shape war, shape empire. An empire is always justified through mythology, is always presenting itself as bringing civilization, bringing progress, bringing enlightenment to those who lack it. And the lack is projected, is assumed, is what the mirror does not show about the empire itself, which is that what it brings is often destruction, is exploitation, is the imposition of its ways onto others who did not ask for them, do not want them, are harmed by them, but the harm is not seen, is not reflected in the mirror, is not part of the narrative, because the narrative is about benevolence, about mission, about the burden that the superior must bear, and the burden is the story that Kipling told, is the myth that empires use, is the claim that domination is duty, that conquest is care. That exploitation is education, and the education is the transfer of culture, is the spreading of the superior ways, is the civilizing mission that justifies everything, that makes violence noble, that makes theft righteous, that makes subjugation liberation, and the liberation is what the empire claims to bring, is what its mythology proclaims, is what its mirror reflects, and the reflection is believed not just by rulers, but by the ruled, not just by exploiters, but by the exploited, because the mythology is totalizing, is pervasive, is shaping consciousness, is providing the categories through which experience is understood. An understanding within the mythology confirms the mythology, is circular, is self-reinforcing, is making it difficult to see outside, to recognize the distortion, to notice that the mirror is lying, and the lying is not intentional, is not conspiracy, is structural, is the way that collective narcissism operates, is the inevitable result of cultures needing to see themselves as good, as just, as right. And the right is always defined by the culture itself, is always reflecting back what the culture wants to see, is never showing what the culture is afraid to see, which is its own violence, its own hypocrisy, its own contingency. And the contingency is what every national myth denies, is what every claim to exceptionalism rejects, is the recognition that this culture could have been otherwise, that its values are not universal, but are particular, that its supremacy is not deserved, but is the result of power, of conquest, of accident. And the accident is what cannot be admitted, is what the mythology covers, is what the mirror hides, because admitting accident is admitting that the culture is not special, is not chosen, is not fulfilling destiny, but is just existing, just happening, just being one arrangement among many possible arrangements. And the many is what threatens, is what the other represents, is what must be denied in order to maintain the belief that we are the centre, are the standard, are the measure. And the measure is how cultures see others, is how they project onto difference. Everything they reject in themselves is how they create the barbarian, the savage, the backward, the enemy. And the enemy is necessary, is required by the mythology, is what defines the culture by contrast, is what makes us good by being bad, is what makes us civilized by being savage, is what makes us superior by being inferior. And the inferior is not discovered but is created, is constructed through the selection of differences, through the exaggeration of contrasts, through the interpretation of practices as evidence of backwardness. And the backwardness is what justifies intervention, justifies domination, justifies the spreading of our ways, because if they are backward, then they need us, need our help, need our civilization. And the civilization is what we bring, what we impose, what we force upon them for their own good. And the good is what we define, is what our values dictate, is what our mythology proclaims. And the proclaiming is not listening, is not dialogue, is not exchange, is imposition, is violence, is the erasure of their culture in the name of bringing them ours. And the erasure is not seen as violence, but is seen as progress, is seen as liberation, is seen as the inevitable movement toward the universal, which is really the particular disguised as universal, is our particular values presented as the values, our particular ways presented as the way, our particular culture presented as culture itself. And culture itself is what we believe we are, is what the mirror shows, is what the mythology claims, that we are not just a culture, but our culture, are not just civilized, but our civilization, are not just one way of being human, but are the way, the correct way, the superior way, and the superiority is what cannot be questioned internally, is what is taboo to doubt, is what is defended violently when challenged. Because challenging the myth is challenging the culture's identity, is threatening the collective narcissism, is disturbing the mirror, and the mirror must be maintained, must be protected, must be polished, because without it the culture would have to see itself as it is, would have to confront its ordinariness, its violence, its contradictions. And the contradictions are everywhere, are visible to outsiders, are obvious to those who are not invested in the mythology, but are invisible to insiders, are not reflected in the mirror, are edited out of the narrative, are the blind spots that every culture has, that every mythology creates, that every collective narcissism requires, because seeing the contradictions would require changing, would require admitting error, would require acknowledging that the culture is not what it claims to be, is not as good as it believes, is not as just as it proclaims, and the proclaiming is constant, is part of the mythology, is the endless assertion that we are different, are better, are special, are the exception to the patterns that govern other cultures. And the exception is what every empire believes, is the myth of American exceptionalism, of British civilizing mission, of French universal values, of every dominant culture that has ever existed, each believing that it is different, that it is not like the empires that came before, that its domination is justified where others were not, that its violence is necessary where others was cruel, that its expansion is liberation where others was conquest. And the difference is illusion, is projection, is the mirror showing what the culture needs to see, which is that we are good, are noble, are doing what is right, and the right is whatever we are doing, is whatever serves our interests, is whatever maintains our power, and the power is presented as service, as burden, as duty, and the duty is what the mythology creates, is the belief that we must spread our ways, must bring our civilization, must impose our order, because without us the world would be chaos, would be darkness, would be backward, and the backward is where others are, is what defines them, is what justifies our dominance, and the dominance is not called dominance, but is called leadership, is called guidance, is called help. And the help is not asked for, is not wanted, is imposed, is forced, is the violence that the mirror does not show, that the mythology does not name, that the culture does not see, because seeing it would require shattering the mirror, would require abandoning the myth, would require confronting the collective narcissism. And the confronting is what cannot happen, is what is too threatening, is what would destroy the culture's sense of itself. And the sense of itself is what the culture is the only coherence it has, is the mythology that makes it a culture rather than just a collection of people. And so the mirror is maintained, the myth is preserved, the narcissism continues, and the culture sees itself as it needs to see itself, as special, as superior, as exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the distorted reflection that is mistaken for reality, is the mirror stage of culture where the culture is forever trapped, forever seeing the idealized image, forever believing the mythology, forever blind to the contradictions, forever projecting onto others what it cannot acknowledge in itself, forever creating the other who absorbs the negativity, who represents the threat, who justifies the violence, and the violence continues, the mythology persists, the mirror remains, and cultures continue to see themselves as the center, as the standard, as the exception, and the exception is the lie, is the delusion, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every mythology maintains, that every mirror reflects, and the reflecting is distorting, is hiding, is preventing the culture from seeing what it is, from acknowledging its contingency, from recognizing its violence, from confronting its contradictions, from shattering the mirror, from abandoning the myth, from giving up the narcissism. And the giving up is impossible, is what cultures cannot do, is what would mean their dissolution, their end, their transformation into something else. And the something else is what is feared, is what the mythology prevents, is what the mirror hides, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is the function, is what the distorted reflection accomplishes, is what makes cultures culture, is what allows collective identity, is what creates the binding force, and the force is mythology, is narrative, is the mirror that shows not truth, but need, not reality, but fantasy, not what is, but what must be believed. And the belief is collective, is shared, is the myth that we are special, are chosen, are exceptional, and the exceptional is the delusion, is the mirror stage of culture, is the permanent condition of collective consciousness, is the way that societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives, and the narratives are false, are projections, are narcissistic, and the narcissism is structural, is necessary, is what makes culture possible, is what creates cohesion, is what maintains the illusion that we are the center, are the standard, are the measure, and the measure is the mirror, is the myth, is the collective narcissism that every culture exhibits, that every society maintains, that every empire believes, that every nation proclaims. And the proclaiming is the distortion, is the reflection, is the mirror stage where culture is trapped, where it sees itself not as it is, but as it needs to be, not as truth, but as mythology, not as one among many, but as the one, the exceptional, the special, the superior. And the superior is the lie, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs for itself, where it reflects its own image, where it sees only what it wants to see. And what it wants to see is that it matters, that it is right, that it is good. And the good is the reflection, is the myth, is the collective narcissism, is the mirror stage of culture where every culture is trapped, where every society remains, where every empire believes its own mythology, and the mythology is the mirror, is the distortion, is the way that cultures see themselves, as exceptional, as special, as superior. And the superior is the delusion, is the projection, is the narcissism, is the mirror stage that never ends, that continues forever, that defines culture, that creates the blind spots, that maintains the myth, that polishes the mirror, that reflects the lie. And the lie is believed, is shared, is what makes culture culture. And culture is the mirror, is the stage, is the collective narcissism, is the distorted reflection, is the mythology, is the illusion that we are exceptional. And the exceptional is what every culture believes, is the universal delusion, is the mirror stage of culture that shows not truth but need, not reality but fantasy, not what is but what must be seen. And the seeing is distorted, is narcissistic, is collective, is the way that cultures see themselves, forever, inevitably, necessarily, as the center, as the standard, as the exception. And the exception is the myth, is the mirror, is the stage where culture performs, where it reflects, where it believes its own lies, and the lies are the culture, are the mythology, Are the collective narcissism? Are the mirror stage that every society inhabits, that every culture maintains, that every empire believes? And the believing is the distortion, is the reflection, is the way that cultures see themselves as exceptional when they are ordinary, as superior when they are equal, as chosen when they are contingent. And the contingent is what the mirror hides, is what the myth denies, is what the collective narcissism protects against. And the protection is permanent, is structural, is what makes the mirror stage of culture eternal, inevitable, universal. The way that all societies see themselves as distorted reflections, as idealized images, as mythological narratives that are believed, that are shared, that are maintained, that are the culture, that are the mirror, that are the stage, that are the collective narcissism that defines human social existence, that creates the blind spots, that justifies the violence, that maintains the myth, that every culture exhibits, that every society believes, that every empire proclaims. And the proclaiming is the mirror, is the stage, is the distorted reflection that is culture seeing itself. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present. And the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse. And reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made it, made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time. And the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it. And the leading is not temporal propagation, but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins, but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality, and actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it. As effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result but is the cause, is not the effect but is the origin, is not what the past produces but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real and leaves others merely possible. And possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present creating the past, is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor, but is structure, is the way time actually works, is the geometry of events, is the architecture of causation. And causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now. And now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse, and reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation, and causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history, and history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes, are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands, and demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results, when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was, is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result, when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show. That time moves backward, that causation is reversed, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward.